powered down their assembly lines. Human medical stations that treated patients from hundreds of worlds evacuated their staff and sealed their doors. The humans were not just leaving the council. They were taking everything with them. Commander Ben Carter stood on the bridge of the defensive station at Proxima Post and watched the evacuation proceed with military precision. The outpost sat at the edge of council space, monitoring the border with the hostile Kryn Empire. For 20 years, this station had served as the primary warning system and first line of defense against Kryn incursions. Ben had commanded the human contingent for 5 of those years, working alongside Valorian Xanther and a dozen other species to maintain peace. The Valorian co-commander, a stern officer named Kelva, stormed onto the bridge demanding answers. She wanted to know why human personnel were packing equipment and preparing to abandon their posts. Ben calmly explained that humanity was withdrawing from all council operations. Kelva's face went through several color changes as she processed this information. She insisted that Ben could not simply leave, that the defense treaty required human participation, that the council had not approved this action. Ben smiled politely and reminded her that the defense treaty was signed between humanity and the council. Since humanity was no longer a council member, the treaty no longer applied. He wished her good luck defending the sector and returned to his work. Kelva tried to physically block human personnel from removing equipment, but Ben simply walked around her. Within 12 hours, every human had left Proxima Outpost. The defensive grid that humans had built and maintained went offline. The sensor network fell silent. The response protocols that human tacticians had developed became useless without human forces to implement them. The pattern repeated across 73 defensive positions. Humans withdrew from border stations, patrol routes, and joint military facilities. They took their ships, their weapons, their technical expertise, and their tactical knowledge. The Council Military Command suddenly found itself trying to defend territory that had tripled in vulnerability overnight. Admiral Jack Morgan appeared before the Galactic Council one final time, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically from Richard's last appearance. Jack did not stand at the petitioner's podium. He stood at the main floor entrance, broadcast on every screen in the chamber. He wore his full dress uniform, his chest covered in medals earned during 3 decades of defending council space. His message was brief and delivered without emotion. Humanity was withdrawing all military cooperation effective immediately. Every defense pact humanity had signed was now void. Every technology sharing agreement was terminated. Every joint operation was canceled. Humanity would defend its own territory and its own interests. The council was free to do the same. Jack did not take questions. He simply saluted, not in respect, but in farewell, and cut the transmission. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted over each other, demanding explanations, calling for sanctions, suggesting military action to force human compliance. Chancellor Vryn tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the noise. The Xanther military faction proposed sending ships to human space to enforce the treaties. The Valorian delegation calculated how many of their defensive positions were now critically undermanned. Smaller species representatives frantically tried to determine how this affected their own security arrangements. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Kate Morrison led a fleet of 30 human warships to the new boundary humanity had established. The ships positioned themselves in a careful formation, along what humans were now calling the Independence Line. Kate's orders were clear. Human space began here. Council vessels were no longer welcome without explicit permission. Any attempt to cross the line would be turned back. Any attempt to force passage would be met with appropriate force. The human ships activated their sensor arrays and began broadcasting a simple message on all frequencies. This space is under human jurisdiction. All council authority ends at this boundary. Kate watched her displays as council ships in the area detected the human fleet and scrambled to respond. Several Xanther patrol vessels approached the line, but stopped when they saw the human formation. Kate kept her weapons offline, but her shields at full power. The message was clear to anyone watching. Humanity was not asking permission anymore. On Earth, President Greg Hamilton addressed the Unified Government Assembly. The room was packed with representatives from every human nation and colony. Greg spoke about the 30 years humanity had spent trying to earn respect through patience and compromise. He talked about the lives lost because Council species considered human safety expendable. He mentioned the technologies humanity had shared freely while receiving nothing in return. He listed the insults, the restrictions, the double standards that humanity had endured. Then he talked about what came next. Humanity would focus on its own development, its own people, its own future. Human colonies would expand without asking Council permission. Human trade routes would be established based on human interests. Human military forces would defend human space according to human priorities. The Council had treated humanity as subordinates for 3 decades. Now humanity would show them what independence truly meant. The assembly erupted in applause. Greg raised his hand for silence and continued. This was not about revenge or anger. This was about self-respect. Humanity had proven itself countless times and received only contempt in return. No more. The galaxy would learn to deal with humanity on equal terms, or not at all. Back in Council space, the reality of the situation became clearer with each passing hour. Trade routes that humans had protected saw an immediate increase in pirate activity. Border sectors that humans had patrolled reported Kryn scout ships probing for weaknesses. Manufacturing that humans had managed ground to a halt as other species tried to figure out the complex systems. Medical facilities that humans had staffed turned away patients because no one else knew how to operate the equipment. Chancellor Vryn received a priority message from the Council's military command. The Kryn Empire had detected the withdrawal of human forces and was moving ships toward the now vulnerable border regions. Without human tactical coordination, the Council's response time had increased by 400%. Without human weapons technology, their defensive firepower had dropped by 60%. Without human personnel, they simply did not have enough trained people to maintain the defensive grid. The Xanther delegate, who had joked about humanity's departure, sat in his quarters reviewing economic reports. 17 Xanther worlds relied on human agricultural products. 9 Xanther industrial centers depended on human-manufactured components. The Xanther military used human tactical software in 70% of its ships. All of it was gone. All of it had vanished in less than 2 days. The Valorian delegate read reports from her own government with growing dread. The Valorian economy had contracted by 12% in 48 hours. The Valorian military reported that defensive capabilities had fallen to crisis levels. Valorian citizens were demanding answers about why their government had allowed this to happen. Across Council space, the same realization spread like a cold wave. Humanity had not been the junior member the Council believed them to be. Humanity had been the foundation holding everything together, and now that foundation had walked away, leaving the Council to discover just how much they had depended on the species they had treated with contempt. 3 weeks had passed since the human withdrawal, and the Galactic Council faced a crisis that grew worse each day. The Kryn Empire had launched coordinated attacks against 4 border sectors that humanity used to defend. Council military forces scrambled to respond, but their efforts were chaotic and ineffective. Ships arrived at battle zones hours late, because no one had maintained the rapid deployment protocols that human tacticians had designed. Defensive formations fell apart because the species involved had never learned to coordinate without human commanders managing the communications. Chancellor Vryn convened an emergency session in the Council chamber. The atmosphere was completely different from 3 weeks ago. No one was laughing now. The Xanther delegate sat quietly, his forearms folded in a gesture that his species used to show concern. The Valorian delegate looked exhausted, her skin showing stress patterns that indicated she had not slept properly in days. Representatives from smaller species whispered urgently to each other, their voices carrying a tone of barely controlled panic. Vryn presented the situation with brutal honesty. The Kryn had captured 2 minor outposts and were advancing toward more significant targets. Council forces had engaged them in 3 separate battles and lost every encounter. Casualty reports showed numbers that made several delegates gasp. Economic data showed that 14 species were experiencing severe disruptions to their supply chains. Medical facilities across Council space were operating at reduced capacity. Crime rates had jumped 40% in sectors where human patrols used to maintain order. The Valorian delegate stood and spoke about her government's analysis. They had run projections based on current trends. If the Kryn continued their advance at the present rate, 17 coup, Insil worlds would be under direct threat within 2 months. The Council Military Command estimated they would be unable to defend more than half of those worlds without human support. She paused and looked around the chamber. Her next words were difficult for her to say. Valorian leadership was recommending immediate diplomatic outreach to humanity to negotiate their return. The Xanther military faction representative objected strongly. He argued that the Council should not show weakness by begging humanity to return. They should instead impose sanctions on human space, blockade human trade routes, and demonstrate that the Council did not need humanity's help. Several other delegates voiced agreement. Though their words sounded hollow even to themselves, Director Helen Price sat in the command center of the Human Border Station and monitored the Council's crisis with professional detachment. Her screen showed the movements of Council ships, the advance of Kryn forces, and the growing chaos in what used to be orderly space. She received regular intelligence reports from sources deep within Council territory, information that painted a clear picture of the deteriorating situation. One particular report caught her attention. A junior Valorian analyst named Thesa had sent encrypted data through unofficial channels. Thesa had compiled comprehensive information about the Council's military readiness, economic stability, and political cohesion. The data showed what Helen already suspected. The Council was collapsing faster than even optimistic human projections had predicted. Thesa's analysis included casualty estimates for the coming months that made Helen's stomach turn. Millions of civilians would die if the Kryn were not stopped. Helen forwarded the data to Earth with her own assessment. The Council was reaping what they had sown, but innocent people would suffer for their leaders' arrogance. She did not recommend action. She simply provided information. The decision about how humanity would respond belonged to people above her authority level on Earth. President Greg Hamilton met with his closest advisors in a secure conference room. General Paul Bennett presented 3 formal options. First, humanity could offer humanitarian aid to Council civilians while maintaining political separation. Second, humanity could maintain complete isolation and let the Council solve its own problems. Third, humanity could exploit the Council's weakness to expand human territory and influence. Greg listened to each option and the arguments supporting them. General Bennett favored limited humanitarian intervention. The Secretary of Defense argued for complete isolation to teach the Council a lasting lesson. The Secretary of State suggested that territorial expansion would only prove the Council's accusations about human aggression were correct. Greg sat quietly for several minutes after everyone had spoken. Then he presented a 4th option that surprised the entire room. Humanity would do nothing, and they would do it loudly. They would not send aid, not offer assistance, not expand territory, and not make any threats. They would simply continue their withdrawal and let the Council watch as every problem humanity used to solve became unsolvable without them. The Council needed to understand fully what they had lost before any conversation about the future could be meaningful. The advisors debated the approach for another hour, but eventually agreed. Greg signed the order. Humanity would maintain its borders, protect its interests, and ignore all Council communications. The silence would be more powerful than any statement. The Galactic Council attempted to reopen diplomatic channels with humanity. They sent formal messages through every available means. The messages were carefully worded, much more respectful than anything the Council had sent to humans in 3 decades. They spoke of mutual interests, shared concerns, and the potential for renewed cooperation. Some messages even included phrases that approached apology, though they stopped short of actually admitting fault. Every message went unanswered. Human communication arrays received the transmissions, logged them, and filed them away. No human official responded or acknowledged receipt. The silence from human space was absolute and intentional. Ambassador Richard Cole sat on his porch on New Montana Colony and read the Council's messages on his personal tablet. He had retired from active diplomatic service, but Earth still forwarded him the communications for his review. He read each one carefully, analyzing the language and noting the progression from demanding to requesting to almost pleading. He sent his analysis to the current diplomatic corps with a simple note. They still do not understand. They are offering concessions, but we are not negotiating anymore. The situation continued to deteriorate. The Kryn Empire captured its first major council world, a Valorian colony with a population of 4 million. The planetary defense forces fought bravely, but were overwhelmed within 18 hours. The Kryn began immediate occupation operations, and refugee ships fled the system, carrying whoever could escape. Council media broadcast images of the refugees, hoping perhaps that humanity would be moved to action by the humanitarian crisis. Human officials watched the broadcasts, felt genuine sympathy for the civilians caught in the violence. But sympathy did not equal responsibility. Humanity had warned the Council for years that their defensive arrangements were inadequate. Humanity had offered to strengthen border defenses and been rejected. The blood of those civilians was on the Council's hands, not humanity's. Trade routes throughout Council space saw a massive increase in pirate activity. The criminal organizations that operated in the sector had always existed, but human patrol vessels had kept them suppressed. Without that pressure, pirate fleets grew bold. They attacked merchant ships, raided cargo stations, and even began demanding protection payments from some of the smaller species. Council security forces tried to respond, but they lacked the coordination and rapid deployment capabilities that human forces had provided. A delegation of minor species representatives arrived at the human border station Sentinel Point. These were not the major powers of the Council, but smaller civilizations that had always maintained friendly relations with humanity. They requested permission to enter human space and meet with human officials. Director Helen Price reviewed their request and granted it after confirming their identities and intentions. Ambassador Laura Jenkins, who had taken Richard's place as humanity's chief diplomat, met the delegation in a neutral conference room aboard the station. The delegates included representatives from 7 species, none of which had ever voted against human interests in the Council. They did not come with demands or offers of trade. They came with something the Council leadership had never given humanity. They came with an apology. The senior delegate, an elderly being from a species called the Rinth, spoke for the group. He explained that his people and the others present had always opposed the treatment humanity endured in the Council chamber. Their voices had been drowned out by the major powers, their votes meaningless against the dominant blocs. They had watched with shame as humanity was insulted, restricted, and dismissed. They were too weak to stand with humanity then. They wanted humanity to know they had never supported the injustice. Laura listened carefully to the delegate's words. She heard genuine regret in his voice, saw real shame in his expression. These species had not mistreated humanity. They had simply lacked the power to stop others from doing so. She thanked them for their honesty and their courage in coming forward. The Rinth delegate made a request. His people and the other species present wanted to maintain their friendship with humanity. They were not asking to join human defensive agreements or seek human protection. They simply wanted to continue trade and cultural exchange separate from the Council's authority. They were willing to leave the Council if necessary to maintain their relationship with humanity. Laura considered the request carefully. She told the delegates she would present their offer to Earth for consideration, but she personally supported maintaining these friendships. Humanity's dispute was with the Council leadership and the major powers that had dictated policy. Species that had treated humans with respect deserved respect in return. The meeting ended with handshakes and genuine warmth. Laura watched the delegates depart and felt a small measure of hope. Perhaps something better could be built from the ruins of the old Council. Perhaps a new organization based on actual equality rather than the pretense of it. The situation spiraled beyond crisis into something approaching catastrophe. The Kryn Empire had now captured 3 Council worlds, and their advance showed no signs of slowing. Council military forces suffered defeat after defeat, each battle revealing new weaknesses in their coordination and strategy. Ships arrived at wrong coordinates because the navigation protocols humans had designed were no longer maintained properly. Weapon systems failed because the maintenance schedules humans had established were not being followed. Communications broke down because different species could not agree on priority channels without human mediators to settle disputes. Chancellor Vryn stood before the council chamber and delivered a speech that many delegates would remember for the rest of their lives. His voice carried none of its usual confidence. He spoke plainly about the failure ease of council leadership, including his own. The council had treated humanity with contempt for 30 years, and now they were paying the price. Billions of council citizens faced danger because their leaders had been too arrogant to recognize humanity's value. Vryn proposed a formal restructuring of council protocols to address human grievances and a complete overhaul of how member species were treated. The Xanthar military faction erupted in anger at Vryn's words. Their senior representative accused him of cowardice and weakness. He argued that the council should never bow to human pressure, that accepting human terms would destroy the council's authority. Other delegates from the major powers voiced similar objections, though their words lacked conviction. The chamber knew the truth, even if some refused to admit it. The council was dying, and only humanity could save it. The chamber descended into chaos as delegates shouted at each other. Some demanded immediate reconciliation with humanity at any cost. Others insisted the council should stand firm, even if it meant their destruction. Smaller species representatives begged for someone to do something while their worlds burned. The session ended without any decision being reached. The council had fractured into competing factions, each with different ideas about how to proceed. Captain Derek Walsh commanded a human fleet conducting maneuvers near the border of what used to be council space. His orders were specific and came directly from Earth's military command. Demonstrate capability without aggression. Show strength without threatening. Let the council see what humanity had become while they were busy dismissing human potential. Derek's fleet consisted of 42 vessels ranging from small frigates to massive battlecruisers. They moved through space in formations that were new patterns that council observers had never seen before. The ships performed coordinated jumps, split into groups and rejoined, and executed tactical movements that would have been impossible for the old human fleet. 3 decades of experience defending council space had taught humanity valuable lessons. 3 weeks of freedom from council restrictions had allowed humanity to implement improvements they had always wanted to make. Council military. Observers watched the maneuvers with growing alarm. They recorded every movement, analyzed every formation, and ran simulations based on what they saw. The reports they sent back to their commanders painted a disturbing picture. Human naval doctrine had evolved significantly beyond what council intelligence had estimated. The ships showed better coordination than any council fleet could achieve. The weapon signatures indicated technology that surpassed current council standards. The defensive capabilities suggested shield systems that were at least a generation ahead of council designs. Derek smiled as he read the intercepted council transmissions. They were finally starting to understand. Humanity had never been weak. They had been restrained by diplomatic protocols and treaty obligations. Now those chains were gone, and humanity was showing its true capabilities. Derek ordered his fleet to continue the exercises. Let the council watch. Let them realize what they had taken for granted. The Xanthar Military Command held an emergency meeting to assess the human fleet movements. Their best tactical analysts reviewed the data and reached a unanimous conclusion. In a direct military confrontation, Council forces would lose badly against humanity. The technological gap was significant, but not insurmountable. The real problem was doctrine and coordination. Humans fought as a unified force with seamless communication and shared tactical understanding. Council forces were a collection of individual species militaries that barely worked together even under the best circumstances. The Xanthar representative, who had joked about humanity's departure, sat in his office reading the military analysis with shaking hands. His government had been building its defense strategy around the assumption that humanity was militarily inferior to the major council powers. That assumption was wrong. catastrophically wrong. The Xanther military had fewer ships than humanity, older technology, and inferior tactical training. If humanity ever decided to use force, his people would be helpless. The Valorian leadership reached a similar conclusion through their own analysis. They went one step further and ran economic projections. Even if the Council somehow resolved the military crisis without human help, the economic damage would take decades to repair. Valorian industry was already contracting at unprecedented rates. Unemployment had reached 15% and was climbing. Food shortages were beginning in some regions. Medical supplies were running low. The Valorian economy had been built on a foundation of trade relationships that no longer existed. Chancellor Vienne received intelligence reports from multiple sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. The Council could not survive without humanity, not in its current form, possibly not at all. He faced a choice between pride and survival. The Council could maintain its dignity and collapse, or it could admit its mistakes and beg humanity for help. Vryn made his decision. He drafted a personal message to Ambassador Laura Jenkins. The message acknowledged the injustices humanity had suffered. It admitted that the Council had been wrong to treat humanity as inferiors. It offered a complete restructuring of Council authority to ensure equal treatment for all members. It stopped just short of begging, but the desperation was clear in every word. Laura received the message and read it carefully. She noted the changes in tone and language compared to earlier Council communications. This message contained actual acknowledgement of wrongdoing, not just vague references to mutual misunderstanding. She forwarded it to Earth with her analysis. The Council was finally being honest. But honesty after 30 years of lies and 3 weeks of crisis was not necessarily enough. President Greg Hamilton read Vryn's message and called another meeting with his advisors. The discussion lasted for hours. Some argued that humanity should accept the Council's offer and use their stronger position to reshape the organization. Others insisted that the Council was too broken to be fixed and humanity should focus on building something new. A few suggested that humanity should impose harsh terms as punishment for the decades of mistreatment. Greg listened to all perspectives before speaking. He pointed out that accepting the Council's offer would put humanity back into the same basic structure that had failed before. Even with better rules, the underlying problems would remain. The major powers would still have disproportionate influence. The smaller species would still be ignored. The whole system was built on hierarchy rather than genuine cooperation. Meanwhile, ships carrying refugees from captured Council worlds began arriving at the borders of human space. Millions of civilians had fled the Kryn Advance with nowhere to go. Some made it to other Council worlds, but many found those places overwhelmed and unable to help. In desperation, some refugee ships headed toward human territory. Hoping that humanity's famous compassion would extend even to those whose governments had treated them poorly, Director Helen Price faced a dilemma. Her orders were to maintain the border and keep Council ships out of human space. But the ships approaching her station were not military vessels or trade ships. They were civilian transports packed with families who had lost everything, children who had watched their worlds burn, elderly beings who had fled with nothing but the clothes they wore. Helen contacted Earth for guidance. The response came quickly. President Hamilton personally authorized humanitarian assistance for civilian refugees. Humanity's dispute was with the Council leadership, not with innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Human medical ships and supply vessels were dispatched to the border. Refugee camps were established on uninhabited worlds in human territory. Food, medicine, and shelter were provided without conditions or demands for payment. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. The Council governments that had ruled for 1,000 years were unable or unwilling to care for their own people, humanity. The species those governments had called too young and too aggressive stepped in to help without hesitation. Refugees, who arrived expecting to be turned away or exploited, found themselves treated with dignity and kindness. News of humanity's humanitarian efforts spread quickly through Council space. Media broadcasts showed human medical personnel treating wounded Valorians. Images appeared of human engineers building shelter facilities for Xanther families. Reports described human food distribution centers feeding thousands of hungry beings. The story being told was clear. Humanity had the power to help, and the character to care. Council had neither. Chancellor Vren watched the broadcasts and felt something he had not experienced in his long career. Shame, real, deep shame, that cut through decades of accumulated pride and arrogance. Humanity was showing the Council what leadership actually looked like. Not through force or threats, not through demands or conditions, but through simple acts of compassion toward those in need. The Xanther representative received reports from refugees, his own people. They spoke of human kindness, human efficiency, human generosity. They asked why their own government had treated such beings with contempt. They questioned why the Council had driven away the one species that actually seemed to care about doing what was right. The Council chamber held another session, but the energy had completely changed. Delegates spoke quietly, their earlier anger and pride replaced by exhaustion and despair. They all understood now. Humanity had not just withdrawn from the Council. Humanity had exposed everything the Council pretended to be, but never actually was. The Emperor had no clothes, and everyone could see it clearly. 6 months had passed since. Humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy looked completely different. The Council still existed in name, but its authority had shattered into fragments. The Kryn offensive had finally been stopped, but only after 20 Council worlds fell to occupation. The cost in lives and resources had been staggering. The political cost had been even worse. Member species no longer trusted Council leadership to protect them or present their interests. The major powers that had dominated Council politics for centuries found themselves increasingly isolated. The Xanther government faced internal protests from citizens who questioned why their leaders had treated humanity so poorly. The Valorian economy struggled to recover from the loss of human trade networks. Both species still maintained their seats on what remained of the Council, but their influence had diminished dramatically. Smaller species began making their own arrangements for security and trade. They formed regional alliances based on geography and mutual interest rather than submitting to centralized Council authority. Some reached out to humanity. Others created their own defensive pacts. The galaxy was reorganizing itself around new power structures. Humanity emerged from the chaos as the dominant force in its region of space, not through conquest or intimidation, but through the voluntary association of species that recognize the value of human partnership. Ambassador Laura Jenkins stood in a conference hall in the human colony, world of New Columbia, and watched. Representatives from 23 species signed the document. That would create something new. They called it the Frontier Compact. The agreement was simple and built on principles that the old Council had only pretended to follow. Every member species had equal voice regardless of size or military strength. Territorial sovereignty was absolute and could not be violated under any circumstances. Military cooperation was voluntary, and members could withdraw at any time. Economic arrangements were bilateral between interested parties rather than dictated by central authority. Most importantly, every member committed to treating all others with respect and dignity. The signing ceremony took 3 hours as each species representative added their mark to the document. Laura watched species that had been enemies under the Council system sign as partners in this new arrangement. The old Council had maintained peace through intimidation and complex political maneuvering. The Frontier Compact hoped to maintain peace through mutual benefit and genuine cooperation. Several species that left the Council specifically to join the Compact. The Rinth people were first, followed quickly by 5 others. They explained to their former Council colleagues that they preferred a system where their voices mattered. Within weeks, 3 more species formally withdrew from Council membership and applied to join the Compact. The exodus was not massive, but it was significant. The Council was bleeding members to an organization that humans had built in less than 6 months. Commander Ben Carter, now promoted to Admiral, oversaw the integration of compact military forces. He worked from a command center on Sentinel Station, coordinating with officers from a dozen different species. The difference between this and his old Council posting was remarkable. Here, every species contributed according to its capabilities, and all contributions were valued equally. Strategic decisions were made collectively with input from every member. No single species could veto actions or impose its will on others. The compact defensive network functioned better than the Council's ever had, despite being much smaller. Human tactical doctrine formed the foundation, but each species added its own innovations and improvements. The Rinth had excellent sensor technology. A species called the Drell contributed advanced shield designs. Another group known as the Kessick provided specialized weapon systems. Together they created a defense force that was flexible, efficient, and surprisingly powerful. When a pirate fleet that had grown bold during the Council's collapse attempted to raid a compact world, they found themselves facing a coordinated response from 4 different species. The battle was over in 20 minutes. The pirates were captured, their ships impounded, and a clear message was sent to anyone watching. Compact space was protected, and violators would face consequences. The Council military observed the engagement with professional interest. Their analysis noted the speed of the compact response, the seamless coordination between different species, ships, and the effectiveness of their combined tactics. The report concluded that the Frontier Compact, despite having fewer total ships than the Council, was militarily superior in every meaningful way. On Earth, President Greg Hamilton addressed a joint session of the Unified Government Assembly. He spoke about the 6 months since humanity's withdrawal and what had been accomplished. Human colonies were expanding at unprecedented rates. Human trade was flourishing through direct bilateral agreements. Human technology development had accelerated without Council restrictions holding it back. Most importantly, humanity had helped create a new galactic organization that treated its members as genuine equals. Greg acknowledged that many people had questioned the decision to abandon the Council. Walking away had been risky and could have left humanity isolated, but staying would have meant accepting permanent inferior status. Sometimes the only way to win was to stop playing a rigged game. Humanity had gambled that they could build something better in the gamble. It paid off. The Assembly gave Greg a standing ovation. Representatives from every human nation and colony stood and applauded the decision that had seemed so dangerous 6 months ago. Humanity had found its place in the galaxy, not by begging for acceptance, but by demanding respect. Chancellor Vren sat in his private office and watched a recording of Greg's speech. The human president's words stung because they were true. The Council had been a rigged game. The major powers had controlled everything, and smaller species had been forced to accept whatever scraps were offered. Humanity had recognized this and chosen to leave rather than submit. Now humanity was thriving while the Council struggled to survive. Vren had spent the past 6 months trying to reform the Council. Some progress had been made. New protocols gave smaller species more representation. Military coordination had improved slightly. Economic policies were being revised to be more fair, but the fundamental problems remained. The major powers still dominated. Trust was still broken. Members were still looking for the exits. A message arrived on Vren's private terminal. It was an invitation from Ambassador Laura Jenkins to visit New Columbia and discuss potential cooperation between the Council and the Compact. Vren read the message 3 times. The tone was polite but not deferential. Laura was not asking permission or seeking approval. She was extending an offer to talk as equals. Vren accepted the invitation. He made arrangements to travel to New Columbia without the usual entourage or ceremony. This would be a private visit, a conversation between individuals rather than a formal diplomatic exchange. He wanted to see what humanity had built and understand how they had done it so quickly. 2 weeks later, Vren arrived at New Columbia aboard a simple transport rather than a state vessel. Laura met him at the spaceport with a small security detail and a genuine smile. She welcomed him to the Compact and offered to show him around. Vren accepted and spent 3 days touring human facilities, meeting Compact representatives, and observing how the new organization functioned. What struck Vren most was the atmosphere. In Council spaces, every interaction was calculated and political. Species representatives watched each other constantly, looking for advantage or weakness. Here on New Columbia, Delegates from different species ate meals together, joked with each other, and genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company. The difference was subtle, but profound. On his final evening, Laura invited Vryn to dinner at a restaurant overlooking New Columbia's Central Valley. They sat on an outdoor terrace as the sun set over an alien landscape that humans had turned into farmland. Laura ordered local wine, and they talked not as diplomats, but as two people who had watched the galaxy change. Vryn finally said what he had come to say. His people had been wrong about humanity. The Council had been wrong. They had treated humans as inferiors when humans were actually superior in the ways that mattered most: innovation, adaptability, and basic decency. Vryn apologized, not as Chancellor, but as one individual to another. He was genuinely sorry for the pain and injustice humanity had endured. Laura listened to his words, saw that he meant them. She thanked him for his honesty and his willingness to admit mistakes. She told him that many humans had been angry, but anger was fading. Humanity was too busy building the future to dwell on past grievances. The question was not whether the Council could be forgiven, but whether it could change enough to be relevant in the new galaxy. Vryn asked if there was any possibility of cooperation between the coup, Insil, and the Compact. Laura considered the question carefully before answering. The Compact would work with any organization that treated its members with respect. If the Council could genuinely reform and abandon the hierarchical thinking that had caused so many problems, then perhaps cooperation was possible. But humanity would never again accept subordinate status. The Compact would deal with the Council as equals or not at all. Later that evening, Vryn returned to his quarters and found Ambassador Richard Cole waiting for him. The retired diplomat had agreed to meet with Vryn at Laura's suggestion. Richard poured 2 glasses of Earth's whiskey, and they sat in comfortable chairs overlooking the city lights. Vryn asked Richard the question that had been haunting him for months. How had humanity done it? How had they built something so successful so quickly, while the Council with 1,000 years of history was falling apart? Richard took a sip of whiskey and smiled. The answer was simple. Humanity had built the Compact on actual principles rather than empty rhetoric. They treated partners as partners, not as subordinates. They valued contribution over status. They made decisions based on merit rather than politics. Most importantly, remembered how it felt to be disrespected and made sure never to make others feel that way. Vryn nodded slowly. He understood now. The Council had claimed to value equality, but practiced hierarchy. Humanity had experienced that hypocrisy firsthand and chosen to build something different, something honest, something that actually worked. Richard refilled both glasses and looked at the elderly Xanther Chancellor. He spoke gently but firmly. Humanity was not angry anymore. They were simply done waiting for others to recognize what humans had always known. Humanity belonged among the stars, and they would make their own way forward. The question was not whether the Council could accept that. The question was whether the Council could accept that humanity no longer needed their approval. Vryn drank his whiskey and understood that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The old order was dying and something new was being born. Humanity had abandoned all diplomacy with those who never respected them, and in doing so had created something better. A new age had begun, and this time humanity wrote its own rules. The Galactic Council could adapt to this new reality or fade into irrelevance. The choice was theirs, but the galaxy was moving forward either way.